There are women who walk into a room and the atmosphere changes instantly. Not because of beauty, not because of charm, because something hidden is operating behind their eyes. What if the strange confusion, exhaustion, and distraction around you was never accidental? What if certain behaviors were not personality traits, but spiritual signals? Tonight, hidden patterns will be exposed, and what you are about to hear may explain battles you have been fighting for years. She creates chaos everywhere she goes, then pretends to be the victim of the destruction she caused. You must understand this carefully. Not every toxic person is operating in witchcraft, but when confusion follows someone like a shadow, when relationships collapse around them repeatedly, when peace disappears the moment they enter a space, you are dealing with something deeper than attitude. There are spirits that feed on disorder. And one of the oldest tactics of spiritual manipulation is emotional confusion. You meet her, and at first everything feels magnetic. The conversations feel intense. The connection feels unusually fast. She studies your weaknesses before you even realize you are being observed. She learns what hurts you, what you fear, what you crave. Then slowly, subtly, she begins to pull emotional strings. One day she praises you. The next day she humiliates you. One moment she acts deeply attached. The next moment she becomes cold without explanation. And the entire time you begin losing your mental clarity. You start questioning yourself. You replay conversations repeatedly. You lose sleep trying to understand what changed. That is not normal emotional conflict. That is manipulation through instability. And many people never recognize it because the attack feels emotional instead of spiritual. But spiritual warfare often enters through emotions first. That is why some people cannot explain why they feel drained after talking to certain individuals. The body gets tired, the mind gets cloudy, motivation disappears, prayer becomes harder, focus weakens, peace vanishes. Because some people carry darkness they refuse to confront. And if you ignore the warning signs long enough, you can become spiritually entangled in battles you never saw coming. Have you noticed this? Everywhere she goes, division follows. Friends stop speaking to each other. Families begin fighting. Communities become fractured. People suddenly turn against one another without clear reason. Somehow, she is always at the center of the storm while pretending innocence. That pattern matters, because darkness survives through confusion. A manipulative spirit does not always attack openly. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it plants suspicion, sometimes it twists communication until trust collapses. Then it stands back and watches the destruction grow. There are people who become addicted to emotional control. They feel powerful when others are emotionally unstable. They enjoy watching. People chase approval. They gain satisfaction from seeing confusion spread. And if you confront them, they reverse the situation immediately. Suddenly you become the problem. Suddenly you are crazy. Suddenly you are too sensitive. This is why many victims stay trapped for years. Because psychological warfare creates spiritual exhaustion. You begin doubting your own discernment. But listen carefully. Discernment is not paranoia. Spiritual awareness is not hatred. And recognizing darkness does not make you judgmental. It makes you awake. There are relationships that slowly disconnect people from their purpose. You stop dreaming. You stop building. You stop growing. Your energy becomes consumed by emotional survival. And the frightening part is this: many people remain in those environments because the manipulation feels familiar, especially if they grew up around control, intimidation, or emotional instability. The cycle feels normal to them, so they excuse behavior that should have been confronted immediately. You cannot afford that mistake, because whatever constantly destroys your peace is not sent to strengthen your destiny. Look at the fruit. Always look at the fruit. Does your spirit feel heavy around her? Do you feel emotionally suffocated after conversations? Do you feel mentally scattered after interactions? Does fear increase around her presence? Does confusion multiply? Because darkness produces patterns, and patterns reveal what words try to hide. One former, a cult practitioner, explained something terrifying. He said certain manipulative individuals intentionally study emotional weakness because broken people are easier to dominate spiritually. Think about that. The enemy studies wounds. That is why spiritually unaware people often attract destructive relationships repeatedly. They mistake intensity for love, control for protection, obsession for connection. But real love does not destroy your mental stability. Real love does not isolate you from truth. Real love does not drain your soul until you no longer recognize yourself. There is a reason spiritually strong people guard their environment carefully. Because atmosphere matters, energy matters, influence matters. The wrong voice can poison your thinking slowly. And many people never realize they are under emotional oppression until their entire life begins collapsing. Some women weaponize seduction, guilt, emotional instability, and fear because manipulation gives them psychological power. And when spiritual darkness amplifies those behaviors, the destruction becomes even worse. You start feeling trapped emotionally. You feel addicted to their approval. You fear upsetting them. You lose confidence. You begin shrinking your personality just to avoid conflict. That is bondage, not love. Bondage. And one of the clearest warning signs is this: you feel relieved when they are absent. Think about that carefully. Peace returns when they leave. Your mind becomes clear again. Emotions stabilize. Your motivation comes back. Your connection to God strengthens again. That relief is a warning signal. Your spirit recognizes what your emotions are trying to deny. Many people ignore these signs because they are afraid to walk away. Fear of loneliness keeps them connected to destruction. Fear of starting over keeps them trapped. Fear of being misunderstood keeps them silent. But silence can become agreement with your own suffering. You were not created to live under constant confusion. You were not created to lose your identity trying to satisfy manipulation. You were not created to remain spiritually drained every day of your life. Sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is separate yourself from destructive influence before it destroys your future. And hear this clearly: not every attractive face carries a safe spirit. Not every charming personality carries good intentions. Some people know exactly how to appear harmless while carrying deep darkness inside. That is why discernment matters more than appearance. Words can deceive, charm can deceive, emotions can deceive, but patterns reveal truth, always. A dangerous spirit hates exposure. The moment you stop being controlled, the mask begins to crack. The manipulation intensifies. The guilt increases. The emotional pressure grows stronger. Because darkness panics when it realizes it is losing influence over you. And that is the moment many people finally wake up. Not because someone warned them, but because the destruction became impossible to ignore. The second sign is this: she is deeply obsessed with control. Not healthy influence, not leadership, control. There is a difference. A controlling spirit does not want partnership. It wants domination. It wants emotional ownership. It wants access to your thoughts, your time, your confidence, your decisions, and eventually your identity. At first, the control looks harmless. She constantly wants to know where you are, who you talk to, liked your posts, why you did not answer fast enough, why you smiled at someone else, why you need privacy. And many people mistake this obsession for love. But obsession is not love. Control is not protection. Possession is not intimacy. A manipulative spirit slowly trains you to feel guilty for having independence. You start explaining every decision. You start apologizing for harmless things. You begin walking carefully around conversations just to avoid emotional explosions. That is not peace. That is psychological captivity. And the frightening part is this: the control usually increases gradually. Because if manipulation revealed itself fully at the beginning, most people would run immediately. So it grows slowly, like poison entering the bloodstream one drop at a time. First, she controls your attention, then your friendships, then your routines, then your confidence, then eventually your entire emotional world revolves around her reactions. You stop asking what is healthy. You only ask what will avoid conflict. That is how emotional domination works. There are people who cannot feel powerful unless someone else feels weak. And when spiritual darkness fuels that hunger for control, relationships become battlefields. You begin feeling watched constantly, analyzed constantly, corrected constantly. Every conversation feels dangerous. Every disagreement becomes punishment. Every mistake becomes ammunition. And over time, you become emotionally exhausted, not because of one dramatic event, but because of continuous pressure. That pressure destroys people slowly. Some men lose ambition entirely. Some stop pursuing purpose. Some become isolated from family. Some abandon their spiritual life. Some lose confidence they spent years building. Because manipulation attacks identity first. If the enemy can weaken your identity, your boundaries collapse naturally. That is why spiritually controlling people often target confident individuals. They enjoy breaking strong people emotionally. It makes them feel powerful. Have you ever seen someone who constantly creates tests in relationships? She withdraws affection to see if you panic. She becomes cold to force you into chasing her. She creates jealousy intentionally. She threatens to leave repeatedly. She uses silence as punishment. She withholds peace until she gets control again. Those are not signs of maturity. Those are tactics. And many people stay trapped because the relationship becomes chemically addictive. The highs feel intense. The lows feel devastating. Your nervous system becomes attached to emotional instability. You start craving approval from the same person destroying your peace. That cycle is dangerous because confusion creates dependency, and dependency creates vulnerability. One former spiritual counselor explained it this way: the moment someone must shrink their soul to keep a relationship alive, manipulation has already entered the room. That statement shook many people because some relationships survive only when one person remains emotionally small. You cannot speak freely. You cannot disagree honestly. You cannot express pain safely. Everything becomes about managing another person's reactions. And slowly, you disappear inside the relationship. This is one reason spiritually aware people pay attention to atmosphere instead of appearances. Some people look loving publicly while privately creating emotional prisons behind closed doors. And outsiders rarely notice because manipulators often protect their image carefully. In public, she appears charming, soft spoken, supportive, but privately, the intimidation begins. The guilt begins. The emotional punishment begins. The mental games begin. And victims often stay silent because they fear nobody will believe them. That silence becomes deadly. There are people listening right now who already recognize these patterns. You remember how your confidence changed after meeting her. You remember how your peace disappeared gradually. You remember how your instincts warned you early, but you ignored them because emotions were stronger than discernment. That happens more often than people admit. Emotional attachment can blind spiritual perception. That is why discernment requires courage, because truth sometimes forces you to confront what your heart does not want to accept. One of the clearest warning signs of controlling darkness is isolation. She subtly pushes people away from your life. Friends become bad influences. Family becomes toxic. Mentors become threats. Anyone who helps you think clearly becomes a problem. Why? Because manipulation survives best in isolation. The fewer voices speaking truth into your life, the easier you are to control emotionally. That is why many spiritually destructive relationships become extremely possessive. Possession is the goal, not partnership, possession. And once someone gains emotional possession over you, fear enters the relationship. You fear upsetting them. You fear disagreement. You fear abandonment. You fear emotional punishment. That fear changes your personality over time. You become quieter, smaller, more anxious, more uncertain, until eventually you barely recognize yourself anymore. But hear this carefully. Love should strengthen your spirit, not suffocate it. Love should increase clarity, not confusion. Love should build peace, not fear. Any relationship that constantly destroys your inner stability deserves serious spiritual examination. And many people ignore that examination because they are terrified of losing the relationship. But sometimes losing the relationship is exactly what saves your future. Not every closed door is punishment. Some closed doors are protection. Some separations are rescue missions from God. Because there are people who would completely consume your destiny if allowed permanent access to your life. That is why boundaries matter spiritually. A healthy boundary is not hatred, it is wisdom. You do not owe unlimited access to people who repeatedly damage your mental, emotional, or spiritual health. And the moment you begin reclaiming your peace, manipulative spirits often react violently. The guilt intensifies, the accusations intensify, the emotional pressure intensifies. Why? Because control is slipping away. Darkness becomes aggressive when influence begins breaking. That is why many people experience the strongest attacks right before freedom. The manipulation becomes louder, the intimidation becomes stronger, the emotional chaos increases suddenly. But that escalation is often proof that something hidden is being exposed. Never forget this. Anything that constantly demands your silence, fear, confusion, or emotional suffering to survive is not operating in truth. And once you recognize the pattern, you must make a decision. Will you continue surrendering your peace to manipulation? Or will you finally protect your spirit before damage becomes irreversible? She becomes strangely uncomfortable whenever truth, prayer, or spiritual authority enters the atmosphere. Watch carefully, because darkness can imitate emotion, but it struggles to remain calm around genuine spiritual light. At first, you may not notice it. The reaction seems subtle, small shifts, small expressions, small moments of irritation. But over time, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The conversation turns toward God, and suddenly tension appears. Prayer begins, and her mood changes instantly. Truth exposes something, and she becomes defensive, angry, or strangely agitated. Why? Because hidden darkness hates exposure. There are people who can discuss spirituality all day long, as long as it never confronts the condition of their soul. They enjoy mystical language. They enjoy emotional performances. They enjoy appearing spiritually deep. But genuine truth carries authority, and authority makes darkness uncomfortable. One former occult practitioner described this phenomenon in chilling detail. He said some individuals intentionally surround themselves with spiritual language while secretly operating in manipulation, deception, seduction, and emotional control. Outwardly, they appear enlightened. Privately, they are spiritually destructive. That contradiction confuses many people because they assume spiritual vocabulary automatically means spiritual purity. It does not. Some people know how to sound spiritual while carrying deep corruption inside. That is why discernment matters more than appearances. Have you ever noticed someone becoming irritated whenever accountability enters the conversation? You bring up honesty, and they immediately change the subject. You bring up integrity, and they suddenly become defensive. You mention prayer, repentance, discipline, or truth, and the atmosphere shifts instantly. That reaction reveals something, because truth shines light into hidden places, and hidden things fight exposure. Some people cannot tolerate environments where spiritual clarity is strong. They prefer confusion, distraction, noise, anything that keeps deeper truth from surfacing. That is why certain individuals constantly create emotional drama during moments of spiritual growth. You decide to pray seriously, suddenly conflict increases. You start rebuilding your discipline, suddenly arguments appear everywhere. You begin protecting your peace, suddenly emotional manipulation intensifies. Coincidence? Not always. There are forces that resist transformation because transformation breaks control. And one of the clearest signs is this: she mocks or subtly attacks your spiritual boundaries. Maybe she ridicules your convictions. Maybe she pressures you to compromise values. Maybe she treats purity, discipline, or faithfulness like weakness. Maybe she encourages behavior that slowly disconnects you from God. At first, it feels small, harmless, almost playful, but compromise grows gradually. Little by little, your standards weaken, your discernment weakens, your prayer life weakens, your peace weakens. And eventually you look around wondering how you drifted so far from who you used to be. That decline rarely happens instantly. Darkness prefers slow erosion. One decision at a time, one compromise at a time, one moment of weakness at a time, until the person no longer recognizes their own spiritual condition. This is why spiritually mature people guard what enters their life carefully. Not everyone deserves close access to your spirit. Not everyone deserves influence over your mind. Some connections carry destruction disguised as attraction. And many people ignore warning signs because physical attraction blinds spiritual awareness. But attraction alone is never enough reason to trust someone. Never. Some of the most dangerous people appear incredibly charming at first. That charm becomes the doorway. Then the manipulation begins. Then the confusion begins. Then the spiritual heaviness begins. One man described his experience this way: every time I tried to pray seriously, conflict exploded in the relationship. It felt like peace disappeared the moment I pursued God more deeply. That statement revealed something important. Some relationships become hostile the moment spiritual growth increases, because growth threatens control. Light threatens darkness. Truth threatens deception. And hidden things fear exposure. Have you noticed how certain people become deeply uncomfortable around spiritually strong individuals? Not performative spirituality, real authority, real peace, real discernment. Because spiritually grounded people are harder to manipulate. They recognize patterns quickly. They do not surrender boundaries easily. They refuse emotional chaos. And manipulative individuals often become frustrated when their tactics stop working. That frustration eventually exposes their true nature. Suddenly the sweetness disappears. Suddenly the mask cracks. Suddenly anger, intimidation, guilt, or mockery appears. Why? Because manipulation loses power when discernment awakens. One of the most dangerous traps is emotional seduction mixed with spiritual confusion. A person may appear loving while slowly disconnecting you from truth. They make compromise feel reasonable. They make disobedience feel harmless. they normalize dysfunction. And because the relationship feels emotionally intense, many people ignore the spiritual damage occurring underneath. But intensity is not always destiny. Sometimes intensity is warning. You must learn to pay attention to what happens to your spirit around certain people. Do you feel closer to God or farther away? Do you feel mentally clear or constantly confused? Do you feel strengthened or spiritually drained? Do you feel peace or pressure? These questions matter because atmosphere reveals influence. A destructive spirit often survives through distraction, keeping you emotionally overwhelmed, mentally exhausted, spiritually unfocused, too distracted to pray deeply, too wounded to think clearly, too attached to walk away. That is how many people remain trapped for years, not because they lacked intelligence, but because emotional bondage clouded discernment. And hear this carefully. You cannot heal while remaining attached to what keeps poisoning your spirit. Freedom requires honesty, even painful honesty. Some people are terrified to confront truth because truth demands. And decisions change lives, but ignoring truth never protects you. It only delays the consequences. There are moments when God allows exposure for your protection. The mask slips. The manipulation becomes obvious. The hidden darkness reveals itself through patterns no longer easy to ignore. And in that moment, you have a choice. You can continue pretending nothing is wrong, or you can finally acknowledge what your spirit has been warning you about from the beginning. Because deep down, many people sense the danger early. They ignore the uneasiness, ignore the red flags, ignore the exhaustion, ignore the confusion, until the damage became severe. But awakening changes everything. Once discernment opens your eyes, manipulation loses one of its greatest weapons: deception. She feeds off destruction, jealousy, and emotional suffering. Pay attention to that carefully. Because some people feel strangely energized when others are breaking emotionally. They thrive in drama. They enjoy conflict. They secretly celebrate confusion. And whenever peace begins returning to your life, they create another crisis to pull you back into emotional chaos again. That pattern is not normal. Healthy people desire stability. Healthy people desire healing. Healthy people want peace to grow around them. But destructive spirits become restless in peaceful environments. They need tension. They need emotional storms. They need division. Because chaos gives them influence. Have you ever noticed how some people seem disappointed when good things happen to others? A promotion comes, and instead of celebrating, they become cold. A relationship improves, and suddenly strange negativity appears. You begin healing emotionally, and they start creating unnecessary conflict. Why? Because envy is operating beneath the surface, and envy is dangerous. A jealous spirit cannot genuinely celebrate your growth because your growth reminds them of their own inner emptiness. So instead of healing themselves, they attack what shines around them, sometimes subtly, sometimes aggressively. But the pattern always reveals itself eventually. There are people who constantly compare themselves to others until bitterness consumes their heart. Another woman receives attention and jealousy appears instantly. Another person succeeds and criticism begins immediately. Someone else experiences peace and suddenly rumors, manipulation, or emotional attacks emerge. This happens more often than people realize, because unresolved darkness eventually leaks into behavior. What remains hidden inside eventually manifests outside. One former deliverance minister described it this way: some people become addicted to emotional destruction because chaos distracts them from confronting their own brokenness. That statement explains many toxic relationships. Instead of healing, they spread pain. Instead of confronting darkness inside themselves, they project darkness onto others. And anyone who refuses to participate in the chaos becomes a target. Have you ever met someone who constantly pulls attention toward themselves during moments that should focus on others? A family celebration becomes drama. A peaceful evening becomes conflict. A moment of joy becomes emotional tension. Why? Because some manipulative personalities cannot tolerate environments where they are not controlling the emotional atmosphere. They need emotional power. And if peace removes that power, they create disturbance. Again, this is why spiritually mature people pay close attention to patterns of destruction, because patterns expose hidden motives. A person who repeatedly destroys trust, peace, stability, and emotional safety is revealing something deeper than mood swings, especially when the behavior continues without repentance. That word matters, repentance, because everyone makes mistakes, everyone fails, everyone has emotional weaknesses. But a dangerous spirit refuses accountability. It justifies destruction repeatedly. It blames everyone else repeatedly. It manipulates sympathy repeatedly. And over time, victims become emotionally trapped inside cycles of guilt and confusion. You begin excusing behavior that should never have been normalized. You start minimizing emotional abuse. You start convincing yourself that constant suffering is simply part of love. Love is not constant emotional torment. Love is not manipulation. Love is not fear. Love is not psychological warfare. Are people listening right now who feel emotionally exhausted every single day because they are attached to someone who survives by draining others emotionally? The relationship feels heavy constantly. You cannot relax fully. You cannot trust fully. You cannot breathe fully. Your spirit stays alert all the time because deep down you sense danger. That exhaustion matters. The body often recognizes unhealthy environments before the mind accepts the truth. Chronic anxiety, mental confusion, emotional instability, loss of peace, constant tension. These signs should never be ignored, especially when they intensify around specific people. One terrifying reality about destructive relationships is this: the longer you remain inside emotional chaos, the more normal chaos begins to feel. You adapt to dysfunction. You start believing peace is unrealistic. You stop expecting emotional safety. And eventually you become spiritually numb. That numbness is dangerous because numb people stop fighting for freedom. They surrender slowly. This is why awakening is so important. You must recognize when a relationship is consuming your soul instead of strengthening it. You must recognize when manipulation is disguising itself as affection. You must recognize when jealousy is disguising itself as concern. You must recognize when emotional domination is disguising itself as love. Because deception always wears masks. Always. Some people know exactly how to appear innocent while secretly damaging everyone around them emotionally. And many victims remain trapped because they keep waiting for the person to suddenly change. But transformation requires honesty, and honesty requires confrontation. Without confrontation, destructive patterns continue growing. You cannot heal what you refuse to acknowledge. And hear this clearly: protecting your peace is not weakness. Walking away from destruction is not failure. Setting boundaries is not cruelty. Sometimes separation becomes necessary for survival, not because you hate someone, but because you finally understand what their presence is doing to your spirit. There are battles you cannot win while remaining emotionally attached to the source of the damage. That is why discernment is critical. Discernment protects destiny. One wrong relationship can delay purpose for years. One manipulative connection can drain confidence, peace, discipline, finances, focus, and spiritual strength. That is not small damage. That is warfare. The frightening truth is this: many people never realize they are being spiritually and emotionally consumed until their life is already collapsing around them. But once awareness comes, everything changes. The manipulation becomes visible. The emotional traps become visible. The cycles become visible. And visibility destroys deception, because darkness survives through blindness. The moment you finally see clearly, you stop surrendering your peace so easily. You stop explaining away obvious warning signs. You stop calling destruction love. And that awakening may become the very thing that saves your future. You were never created to live chained to confusion, fear, manipulation, and emotional darkness. Your spirit was designed for clarity, authority, peace, and truth. The moment you recognize hidden destruction, you break the power deception once held over your life. No more ignoring warning signs. No more surrendering your peace. No more calling bondage love. Stand up. Spiritually, protect your mind. Guard your destiny. And remember this: darkness loses power the moment you finally see it clearly.